Please welcome Mary Robinson, President of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice and the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on El Niño and Climate, with Julie Gichuru, Founder and CEO of Aramis Media.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see you all here today. To get us started this afternoon, we're going to look at a video and set the context. This is a story of a young girl in Swaziland, and it tells the impact that El Niño and climate change has had on her and her family's lives. So let's take a look at that first.
I love my family, helping my parents in the fields, listening to my grandmother's stories when we cook, even my little brother. I love playing football with my friends, and most of all, I love going to school. I want to be a doctor when I grow up. One day, we heard bad weather was coming that can cause drought, floods, and big storms. We worked harder in the field and stored lots of food. Then the bad weather came. The rain stopped, and we didn't have enough water for our crops. We ran out of food. The bad weather stayed, and soon our cow died. My parents couldn't pay for me to go to school. I don't know if I can ever go back. Maybe I won't be a doctor. With my brother always getting sick, I have to walk so far by myself to get water. I am scared to walk at night. I don't feel safe. The rains are finally starting again, but they say the bad weather might come back soon. If our crops fail again, I don't know what we'll do. I just want to go back to school.
So that animated piece puts it in context, I think, for us. Let me give you a number. 579,000 children in Southern Africa currently face malnutrition, but it's not a sexy story. That's why you don't see it in the news. Many lives have been affected by El Niño. It is more than 60 million people across the globe, and shockingly, 2/3 of these are in Southern Africa, those least responsible. Actually, and in terms of what you've said, Mary, I've seen you speak on this issue. Explain what it means when we say these are the people who are least responsible, and who are the key stakeholders that we need to step up and act.
It's, in a way, a manifestation of climate justice, which I'm working on in my foundation with my colleagues. The injustice of the impacts of climate on poor countries and poor communities. We saw it here in the United States with Katrina and later with Sandy. It was the poorest people who were most affected. And when you bring that to developing countries, they don't drive cars, they don't have central heating, they don't have large industrial... In fact, the whole of Africa is responsible for less than 4% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So that's the injustice. But I have to say, until I got the mandate as the special envoy of the Secretary General for El Niño and Climate last May, I didn't appreciate how bad the problem was, because it's what we call a slow onset problem. It's not like an earthquake. If there's an earthquake, we all know about it, and we quickly rush in. But this was happening, severe drought for 2 years, aggravated by El Niño. And El Niño is a weather pattern. This is the first time that the Secretary General has appointed special envoys, because now El Niño is warming off warmer water off Peru, and then it's a bigger El Niño affecting countries around the world. And I've been to many of those countries, including Swaziland.
I want to get a sense from the room just of how many people thought this was a crisis. If you have had your eye on this issue, please put your hands up, and if you believed it was a crisis. Okay, and if you had no idea and you still are not absolutely convinced that this is a crisis, please put your hands up. Okay, a few, but it's not enough people who are aware of this issue. In terms of what we do next, I know that you are working on a blueprint along with your co-envoy, Ambassador Macharia from Kenya. The challenge is raising the funds for this issue, where clearly there are many who don't even consider it a crisis. So $5 billion, I believe, is the target. We haven't even raised $2 billion. How do we get this money?
Well, this is the point. In a way, when this becomes a huge humanitarian problem, we have failed. We have to admit that. Right. And we're not able to cover the costs because of many other pressures, Syria and refugees in Europe and so on. What Macharia, Kamau and myself are going to do in advising the Secretary General is to say, let's change the approach to a focus on building resilience in communities. This isn't just a humanitarian issue. It is humanitarian, but it's also development, disaster risk reduction, climate-smart agriculture, food and nutrition, gender, because the impacts, as I saw, are huge for women and girls, like we saw on that strip. I mean, the reality is we have to use the time between now and the next El Niño, which is somewhere between 3 and 7 years. It's very predictable that it will happen in that time. And it will be at least as severe as this El Niño, affecting terribly 60 million people. We cannot let that be a humanitarian problem. We have to prepare and work out of silos, work together to make sure, with countries in the lead. And it affects different parts of the world. I was in Ethiopia in June. Ethiopia has very good climate policy. It's admirable. And it has a productive safety net system that covers 8 million people. And luckily, that is there, because otherwise we would have had many deaths. But 10 million more were affected. I was in northern Tigray, northern Ethiopia, looking at acutely malnourished children, a real severity of a problem. I then was in Honduras at the end of July, the dry corridor of Central America. They've never seen drought like it. The water shortage was very severe. I then went to Swaziland, as it happens, because that's where the leaders of Southern Africa were meeting. And I talked to most of the leaders, and every one of them, because I know them well, were impressing on me how severe this is. And then most recently I was in Vietnam. So I just want to give you a sense. It does affect countries in different parts of the world. And these are countries that have not been mainly responsible for the emissions that cause the climate change.
So the stark reality is the majority of countries that are affected are developing nations.
Yes.
And they have huge conflicting interests in terms of what they spend their budgets on, how much they can allocate towards this. How do we, really place the responsibility at the doors of developed countries that are contributing the most and say, look, it may not be affecting you the most, but you need to take the dollars out. You need to contribute to these budgets. How do we compel them?
I think they need to do more than that, because this is, the El Niño impacts are a window into a future that I call the new normal. It's going to continue to be worse and worst in poor countries and poor communities. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we need to get real about dealing with it, as has already been said in this forum. We need to get much more awareness of the fact that industrialized countries must cut their emissions. Right. We need to put a price on carbon. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuel that's killing us, especially coal, but all fossil fuels. We have to do what the Paris Agreement said and have carbon neutral world by the second half of the century. We actually need it by 2051 at the latest. You're much younger than me, all of you in this audience. I'm the old one, the elder. And I can tell you it's your lives, it's your children, it's my grandchildren. I have these 5 grandchildren, and they'll be in their 40s in 2050. They'll share the world with 9 billion other people. And what gets me out of bed in the morning, believe me, is a concern about that world.
We're coming to the end of this conversation, but I do want to get some input from you in the audience. And, just to say, we've been talking about these issues for a while now. Perhaps we hadn't prioritized this as we are doing. But how do we ensure appropriate implementation of some of the issues you've just mentioned? Before I come to you for a final statement on that, can we get a couple of comments? And particularly, I'd love to hear from people who've been in this area, who are in some way contributing or lobbying for policy change, thoughts and questions. If you could put your hands right up, and I'll come straight to you. Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm not involved in any of this work myself, but I especially think the fact that corporations remain a large part of the problem in terms of affecting the climate, affecting
Right.
What steps are going to be most effective to get them to change those policies or change their actions?
Thank you. So the question is, corporations play a big role in all this, and what steps can we take to get them to take responsibility for their actions, Mary?
That is true, and especially the fossil fuel companies, and they have tried to mess up the science and pretend and deny that there is a problem, and they know there is a problem, but they've tried to deny it, and that's unforgivable, frankly. Secondly, I've learned that even corporations putting in clean energy into countries may do it the wrong way. Take away the land rights of poor communities, knock down trees, etc. There was a big problem in Honduras, complaints about big hydro projects and big solar projects, which didn't help the communities themselves.
Right.
So we need to not only take climate action, we need to do it fully respecting human rights and gender equality, and make sure that it's a just approach to how we deal with the problem. And having said that, and in fairness, many businesses now see that climate change is going to affect their business because it's going to be so disruptive if we don't get on top of it. So at the Paris Agreement, there was a whole range of businesses called We Mean Business, a consortium of them who were urging more ambitious action. They were actually behind the idea of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 because they can sometimes be more long-sighted than politicians. They don't have to fight the next election in a few months' time, and they do see. So it's a twofold thing. There is a big responsibility, but also business can help us to get the kind of energy and commitment to deal with this and put a price on carbon, get rid of subsidies, and even the divest movement, which is pretty active here in this country, it all helps.
I'm going to take a comment rather than a question before I get a final statement from Mary. Any comments? Hands right up if you have one. There we go. Please go ahead. Where? Oh, I can't see you. Please just yell it out so we can all hear. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm from Blue Dot, which is a movement that is trying to change Canada's Environmental Bill of Rights. So I'm from Canada, and I know this is the U.S., but basically what we're trying to do is to get public awareness for Canada's Bill of Rights because people don't understand that they're not protected from like harmful pollutants in the environment, but they have the right to know about it. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to change that and get people to know that their Bill of Rights needs to be changed. So what I want to ask is that how do you think people can be made more aware inside the U.S. or Canada so that they can know that these things are in their environment and their Bill of Rights needs to be changed?
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. Can I widen the scope of that even as we come to the end of this? Awareness creation is critical, not just for Canada and the US, but globally. So please go ahead and try to answer that.
I think that is a really good point. There was a sort of separation between human rights and environmental issues. I'm very glad to say that last year we brought them very close together in the Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. If people take those goals seriously, I have my badge here promoting those goals, then we will realize that we have to stop the waste of food, overconsumption, the oceans, all of the kind of planetary boundaries as we now talk about them. The fact, as the Pope said so well in his encyclical, that we're not treating Mother Earth the way we should, the care for our common home. We have to see it in those terms, and part of it is what you're trying to do in Canada, to rethink and, if necessary, redraft bills of rights if people are not aware that we face an existential threat. This is what I really want to bring home. It's not a threat that we have to endure. It's something that we can avoid, but we need to get much more consciousness of the steps we need to take at all levels. And indeed, we need a kind of global movement for climate justice, a global movement for the new climate economy, which means that we rapidly move to renewables and help developing countries. It's more difficult for developing countries to build their economies without fossil fuel, because no rich country's ever done it. We made ourselves rich with the fossil fuel, and then we say we will cut emissions.
Right.
We're not doing it seriously enough, but we're beginning. But the developing countries have to develop on renewable energy if we're going to have a future for our children and grandchildren, because otherwise the carbon space the budget will be completely used up. And that needs money, It needs climate finance.
Right.
It needs transfer of technology to those countries. I'm talking a lot to leaders in developing countries. They are very ambitious about wanting to leapfrog into clean energy, but they say it's very difficult
And it's
We
expensive.
need help.
Congratulations on what you're doing. I think part of what we can all do is be part of the voice that creates the awareness. And to close, Mary, if you were to identify key stakeholders who you need walking this journey with you, who are they and what do you want them to do?
The interesting thing is, it's all of us. It's governments, it's the United Nations, of course, it's the European Union, the African Union, all that, but it's actually changing behavior in every household now, so that we understand that we're in a new era of a normal that will get worse and worse, a new normal of weather shocks, of patterns like El Niño being exacerbated by climate change and hitting the poorest communities, and that we really have to bring this into education, in particular get young people to give some leadership on this, because this is, as I said, your lives, your children and their future. And I think we are changing. I mean, what's happening? Let me give you good news. We had the Paris Agreement last December. It is being ratified much faster than people thought was likely. It will probably come into effect this year. There's a ratification on the 21st of September. If the European Union can get its act together and ratify, I think we're done. We have enough countries. The United States and China gave a very good lead before the G20. And these are the things that matter, that we're saying the Paris Agreement is going to come into effect. Now we have to start implementing. And that means we've got to get off the course that we're on. We're on a course for a world that will be 3 or 4 degrees warming above pre-industrial standards, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius. That is catastrophic. So we're on a catastrophic course. That's not clever.
We need to change our path.
We have to change course, and rapidly.
Thank you so much.
That is why it's everyone. It is the biggest issue of human solidarity in the world today.
Thank you so much. It's your lives. It's your children. It's your movement. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That's great.